They thought the history of this dynasty had been written, edited, and sealed generations ago. But a single envelope, tucked behind a crooked wooden panel in a Fifth Avenue library, is about to reopen a chapter everyone believed was safely buried with the people who signed it. Because inside that envelope is a letter dated 1881. A letter that should never have survived the fires, the auctions, and the careful rewriting of an entire family's past. The mansion reveals nothing of the street. Its facade follows the familiar language of the Gilded Age. Sculpted stone to impress, wrought iron to reassure, a door calibrated to receive names that filled society columns and political speeches. Only upon crossing this threshold does the tone change. The hallway is too silent, the carpets swallow each step, and the library to which the restorer is directed seems less a place for reading and more a room that time has decided not to update. Shelves rise to the ceiling, supporting rows of books that no one has opened for decades. The air carries a mixture of dust, leather, and old wood, and in the middle of this symmetry, a wooden panel is slightly crooked. Behind this misaligned panel emerges the envelope, thick, yellowed, with the seal of a long-defunct law firm partially torn, but still recognizable. On the exposed side, a date, March 1881. Inside, the first lines are written in handwriting honed in both law and discretion. The surnames are not random. They belong to families that helped design railroad maps, consolidate banks, finance campaigns, and occupy mansions along Fifth Avenue. Publicly, they invested in charity and culture. Privately, this letter suggests something more: coordinated stock purchases, agreements to suppress competitors, and the use of intermediaries to keep their own signatures away from any newly created laws to limit their reach. On paper, everything appears as understandings, agreements, support, terms that sound harmless until you compare them with missing lines in the company's accounting books and gaps in official reports. Over time, witnesses who could have explained these gaps were discreetly reassigned, silenced, or dismissed with generous severance packages. Some files were reorganized, others reduced for greater efficiency. Letters burned in basement furnaces. Boxes of minutes disappeared between one administration and another. This envelope survived only because someone, at some point, decided to hide it far enough
away from the safes that it could be easily destroyed, but close enough that it would never leave the house. Have you ever heard a story like this hidden inside a Gilded Age mansion? If this case reminds you of another sealed room or a forgotten heir relegated to the fringes of the family tree, share it in the comments. Stories like this help uncover patterns that official records have tried to cover up. This channel exists to reveal what the elite tried to erase, so subscribe before you forget.
How many times these names reappear when you start digging into the past? Because, by following the ink across the page, the lettering moves beyond the numbers. It suggests an inside decision that never reached the newspapers, a crisis discreetly neutralized, a potential scandal contained before it even had a name. Perhaps even an heir managed as a risk, not as a relative. The newspapers of the time published carefully curated versions of these families, portraits in formal attire, announcements of donations, impressions of the ballrooms. What they never published were the clauses that kept the boardrooms lined up, the politicians' cooperative and inconvenient lives redirected away from Fifth Avenue. And yet, here we are, in a library no longer used, before a misaligned panel and an envelope that has withstood fire, changes of ownership, and the convenience of oblivion. The moment the stamp reappears, the distance between the official story and what currently held this dynasty together begins to collapse. What follows is not a legend, not a parlor tale, but the slow, documented unraveling of an agreement that almost destroyed a Fifth Avenue dynasty from the inside, starting with the simple, stubborn existence of this letter. When that letter was written in 1881, the map of New York's power had not yet been drawn on paper. It was etched in stone along Fifth Avenue. Rows upon rows of mansions rose like private fortresses, each facade displaying a surname that newspapers printed in bold. families connected to railroads, steel, banking, and the new wealth that had quickly learned to behave like the old aristocracy. Carriages stopped at identical staircases, gas lamps burned in meticulous symmetry, and behind those polished doors, the real city was traded in rooms never mentioned in any guidebook of the Gilded Age. Standing there in that library, with the envelope finally opened, it's impossible not to see that street outside in a different light. The duo letter almost resembles a second set of blueprints for the city, one where fortunes aren't built simply through talent or hard work, but through agreements no court has ever reviewed. Names evoking the Vanderbilts, the Goulds, the Astors, the Carnegies appear not as distant references, but as coordinates. They are described as indispensable, cooperative, with shared interests, expressions that might signify philanthropy in public discourse, but which have a much more precise meaning when written in a private memo sealed behind a wooden panel. On the surface, each dynasty maintained its own theater, charity balls, hospital wards, concert halls, and scholarships. Newspapers admired their donations, tallied their guests, and praised their good taste. This was the visible layer of what would later be romanticized as the secrets of the Golden Age. Elegant, glamorous, acceptable. But the letter you hold speaks a different language. Between the lines, it hints at the existence of two families that the press treated as rivals, competing for contracts, prestige, even social dominance, while discreetly they coordinated purchases, predicted stock market moves, and lobbied the same politicians behind closed doors. In public, their lawyers argued. In private, their attorneys drafted joint strategies with the calm of those who knew exactly how much they could lose. The habits of this elite are everywhere. References to special lunches at discreet clubs where no minutes were taken. Notes on prior knowledge of regulatory sentiment, a delicate way of saying that someone on a committee was talking too much. Allusions to conciliatory editorial perspectives at certain newspapers, where a simple phone call from the right office could soften a headline or hide a paragraph on page 5. Outwardly, everything was good taste and refinement. Inwardly, it was a choreography of influence that depended as much on silence as on money. The letter doesn't boast. It assumes the reader already understands how these things work and only needs the timeline and the figures. Every now and then, a phrase emerges that clashes with the calm tone. A line about minimizing exposure in case public opinion changes. Another about limiting records to essential copies. They are small fissures in the polished surface, like fine cracks in marble that only become visible when light hits them from a certain angle. They hint at fear, not fear of losing wealth, but of losing control of the narrative. The greatest risk was never just a financial collapse. It was the possibility of the public suddenly perceiving the perfect synchronicity between these supposedly independent empires. A coordinated sale of railroad shares. A tariff change solicited through indirect channels. A competitor silently deprived of credit while editorials questioned its stability. These people knew how to cover their tracks. Company files from that time show gaps explained as lost in a move or damaged in a fire. Municipal records occasionally reference licenses and permits that no longer have their original attachments. Reporters who once chased scandals end up writing gossip columns or disappear entirely from author lists. Witnesses, when they exist, are labeled disgruntled or unreliable, their accounts swallowed by time. When you hold a letter like this, written in clear, firm handwriting, you're not just reading a plan. You're looking at the part that should never have been left behind after the plan has served its purpose. A silent question hangs over anyone who reads it carefully. Would you keep turning the pages, knowing what this could mean for the reputations that still echo today in museums, foundations, and university buildings? Or would you put it back in the envelope, put the panel back in its place, and let the dark legacy remain where previous generations clearly wanted it? On the walls, not in the ledgers? On some level, every archivist, every historian who comes across a genuine document of the history of the Forbidden Rooms faces this choice. Do you protect the myth or follow the documentary trail wherever it leads, even if it tears apart the foundations of a dynasty that defined an entire part of the city? Families themselves created systems to prevent this choice from reaching outsiders. In-house lawyers handled the most sensitive correspondence. Items that could be compromising were kept in private safes rather than corporate safes. Wills were reviewed in restricted circles, with enough ambiguity to move assets without attracting the attention of regulatory bodies. Board meeting minutes recorded general discussion, never the specific words that would explain why certain decisions had already been made before the meeting began. And when something truly inconvenient did surface, a letter, a ledger, a candid memo, there was always a heater on somewhere in the company, always a night when employees had been dismissed early. What makes this envelope particularly dangerous is the fact that it escaped scrutiny. It doesn't mention full names, but it associates initials with dates, describes transfers that coincide with known events, and hints at the existence of hidden heirs and silent witnesses in a way that aligns with rumors long dismissed as envy or fabrication. There are mentions of adjusting succession expectations and preparing an alternative plan should the current lineage prove unsatisfactory. Phrases that, in isolation, mean very little, but begin to resemble deliberate maneuvers to eliminate an inconvenient branch of the family tree, not through confrontation nor through scandals, but through silent exclusion. A child educated elsewhere, a relative encouraged to settle in another city, a monthly payment recorded in a vague category in the household accounts. Outside, Fifth Avenue continued to shine. Renovated facades, new carriages, photographs of ballrooms that would later illustrate books on the beauty of the era. Inside certain houses, the doors remained closed, not because there was anything to see, but because something had once existed there. A nursery transformed into a storage room. An entire floor reduced to servants' quarters in updated floor plans, though the old plans tell a different story. It is this world that interests beyond the golden halls, not just the chandeliers and the marble, but how a single locked door can say more than 100 society columns. Here, erased records are not just missing pages. They are architectural choices, redecorated hallways, portraits removed and never hung again. In the middle of the letter, almost as a belated addition, there is a reference to aligning the narratives with upcoming public announcements. This seems harmless until we remember how dependent newspapers of the time were on access to information. A family that owned railroads could influence not only freight rates but also how quickly a news story spread, or even if it spread at all. Advertisers could withdraw their ads, editors could be replaced, reporters who asked too many questions about a suspicious merger could be relegated to theater reviews instead of economics columns. By the time a scandal was finally ready to be published, the money had already been moved, the losses had already been offset by profits, and the person who could have explained what really happened had already been encouraged to move west or abroad, with a promise that was never formalized in any official document. At the end of this section of the letter, the handwriting becomes more tense, as if the author had suddenly realized the risk contained in a single sentence. A clause about minimizing the visibility of certain beneficiaries is lost in the air and is resumed in more careful and neutral language. The archivist's fingers hesitate there, tracing the mark where the pen pressed hardest on the paper. The sentence is vague enough to be discarded, but incisive enough to remain in memory. Later, when the family's official genealogy is consulted, a small irregularity stands out, a gap between two lines, an inexplicable space where a name might have been. And in a basement, one floor below the library, in a cabinet of property deeds and household accounts, there is an old family register with a single entry crossed out so completely that only the impression on the paper remains, a name that once existed, now reduced to a hollow groove where there was once ink, and a silence so heavy that it fills an entire room, no longer appearing on the most recent floor plans. Spread out on the table, the letter seems almost unassuming. No gold stamp, no dramatic flourishes, just a sheet of cream-colored paper with the discreet authority of a law firm that knew its clients would never need a logo to be recognized. At the top, in faded ink, the masthead bears the name of a firm that once handled disputes for the city's most powerful industrial families, the kind of place where disagreements were resolved long before anyone thought of involving a judge. The paper itself has survived better than some of the reputations it helped protect. Thick, with a faint watermark visible only when the page is held up by a lamp, edges slightly roughened by time. The ink is no longer as sharp as it was in 1881, but every stroke of the pen remains legible, every curve and straight line pressed into the fibers as if someone had leaned a little too hard on the tip, aware of the weight of what they were writing. The first line is not a greeting. There is no "Dear Sir," no exchange of pleasantries. It begins where most people would hesitate to end, regarding the coordinated acquisition as if the entire conversation had already taken place elsewhere. In a private office, a club with drawn curtains, a carriage where voices could be muffled by the noise of the wheels on the cobblestones. What follows is the language of the Gilded. Age stripped of its public elegance. Phrases like "stabilize the market" and "avoid volatility" sound one way in newspapers, and another when linked to exact dates and quantities in a confidential instruction. The letter lists blocks of shares, the timetable for purchases, the intermediaries who will act on their own behalf, but not for their own benefit. No dramatizations, no adjectives, just numbers, initials, and the assurance that our mutual understanding will avoid unnecessary disruptions. If you didn't know the letter's origin, you might mistake it for a simple informational memo. But small technical details reveal its intent. References to entries in separate accounting books, for example, or to distribution of purchases among accounts not previously used for that purpose. There's a note about how to avoid triggers in the regulatory mechanisms of the time, laws created to prevent a single agent from controlling an excessive share of a railroad or commodity, but still flexible enough to be circumvented by someone who understood where the lines were weakest. In polished speeches, men from these families spoke of fair competition and the proper functioning of the market. On this page, the market is a chessboard, and smaller investors are simply pieces that can be moved, blocked, or sacrificed without explanation. The vocabulary reveals more than the author intended to hide. Instead of saying price manipulation, he uses harmonization. Instead of monopolizing the market, he speaks of creating a predictable environment. When it comes to smaller companies, the language becomes more rigorous, discouraging the entry of speculators, limiting support for unstable operators, ensuring that credit remains with known and reliable institutions. Each of these phrases translates, in practice, into decisions made in rooms the public never sees. Bank managers warned not to lend to certain names, suppliers encouraged to delay deliveries. Until a competitor's cash flow collapses, rumors discreetly spread among brokers that a particular company may not be solid. It is the architecture of exclusion, traced line by line in a handwriting that never wavers. Reading this now, decades after the death of the last person who benefited from these strategies, one can almost hear the implicit conditions. Keep it secret, don't disclose it in official records. Keep the story simple enough that no one remembers to ask where the missing pieces went. The letter never says, "Don't file this away," but suggests that copies be limited to those strictly necessary and that discussions be restricted to pre-agreed channels. This was how the secrets of the Golden Age were built, not with dramatic oaths or conspiratorial codes, but with small instructions on who should see what and when. Once the operation was complete, the companies that disappeared were justified as mismanaged or overburdened. The surviving dynasties were praised for their prudence and vision, their names carved in stone above doors and concert halls, while the real story resided in phrases like those now scattered across this table. The consequences are quietly enormous. Every clause describing how to move shares through intermediaries is, in reality, a decision to exclude someone from the game. When the letter recommends buying during a time of temporary weakness fueled by rumors, it's talking about exploiting the fear that the family itself helped create. Anonymous notes, whispered doubts, a conveniently published article questioning the viability of a smaller railroad. There's a phrase about allowing natural pressure to do the work, which sounds almost harmless until you remember that pressure here means layoffs, pay cuts, factories closing in cities that would never see the gleaming facades of Fifth Avenue. The distance between the elite and the rest of society is preserved not only by marble staircases and private carriages, but by paragraphs like these, written in impeccable legal calligraphy and hidden in what might very well be forbidden rooms within their own homes. Somewhere between the third and fourth paragraphs, the tone shifts again. The author pauses, leaving a slightly larger space before beginning the next sentence, as if choosing words more carefully. What follows is not about markets, but about visibility. To avoid undue attention, it is recommended that any apparent concentration of influence be officially diversified, while the ultimate direction remains unified. It's an elegant way of saying that the world believes there are many hands at work, when in reality, it's the same few names that signal the actions. This is the machine that produces hidden heirs and silent witnesses, not just in families, but in the economy itself. Entire communities become the backdrop for a script written in offices like this, their stories reduced to a line on a balance sheet. The letter never directly mentions newspapers, but between the lines, the press is everywhere. The timing of the announcements is described in relation to favorable reporting cycles. A vague reference to cooperative correspondence suggests journalists who know when to emphasize a rumor and when to let a story die before it reaches the front page. In official archives, the families involved appear as patrons of culture, champions of progress. Here, in the anatomy of this document, they are strategists of silence, adjusting what the public is allowed to see while the real work happens in the blank spaces. What is not recorded is as important as what is: erased records, altered minutes, letters that once existed and are now remembered only by the pale outline they left in a box of ashes somewhere under the old boiler. The archivist's hand hovers for a moment over a specific sentence, tracing the mark where the pen penetrated a little deeper into the paper. Our position, once consolidated, will render smaller businesses unviable within 3 seasonal cycles. No names, just a result. Somewhere, 3 seasonal cycles later, a family business closed its doors, a small station platform fell silent, a city looked at the mansions of Fifth Avenue and tried to believe that some rising tide would eventually reach them. It never did. The people who lived in those mansions donated organs to churches and libraries, posed for portraits, and commissioned ceilings painted with scenes of mythological generosity. But within the walls, documents like this one encoded a different mythology, one in which survival was reserved for those willing to pay the price of protecting a legacy at any cost. And yet, the letter survived. It escaped the rituals of destruction that consumed so many others like it. The bonfires of obsolete files, the discreet cleaning of closets after a death, the careful sorting of anything that could embarrass the inheritance. It is a fragment of a dark legacy that, somehow, refused to be completely erased. A fragment of a much larger system that knew how to erase its own traces. The office that wrote it no longer exists. The street where it was located has changed. The men whose hands once passed over polished desks are buried beneath tombstones that mention service, charity, vision. None of these tombstones mentions that, for at least one night in 1881, the future of several companies rested on a page that would later be relegated to a wooden panel in the library of a mansion. Now, by the light of the lamp, with the rest of the house silent, another detail emerges. In the lower corner, where an employee might jot down a reference or a filing number, there is a small note. A code that should correspond to a folder, a box, a shelf in some long-gone office. When this code is compared with the surviving index in a later file, it corresponds to general correspondence, destroyed. Everything that should explain this letter, contextualize it, was burned, turned to pulp, or simply removed from any list. Only this single document remains, separated from the others, as if it had escaped the fire at the last second. And hanging on the wall above the desk where it now rests is a portrait of one of the dynasty's first patriarchs. His eyes slightly averted, his hand resting on a document that no one can precisely identify. The painted face is as calm as ever, but if you get closer, you can see where the surface has been carefully reworked. Around the edges of the paper he holds, as if something written there has been erased, leaving only the outline of a document that no longer corresponds to the story the family tells about itself, and a silence in the room that seems almost as deliberate as the brushstrokes. A little further down the page, beneath the meticulous logistics of inventory and accounting books, the handwriting changes rhythm. The letters narrow, the strokes come closer together, as if the pen were venturing into territory that even a lawyer from the Gilded Age knew should never truly exist on paper. A new title emerges, not in bold, not underlined, just discreetly centered: Necessary Collaborations. It sounds almost harmless, like the preface of a charity committee. But the first sentence makes it clear that these are not collaborations with philanthropic institutions or orchestras. They are collaborations with figures who occupy seats in state assemblies and on the floor of Congress. The language is dry. Continuous alignment with key voices will be essential to securing favorable outcomes on tariff classification issues, rail concessions, and consolidation approvals. No party is explicitly named, only vague initials and titles: commission chair, senior member, sympathetic speaker. Yet each sentence evokes a faint echo of the historical record: a tariff that suddenly shifts in the right direction, a rail right-of-way granted despite local opposition, a merger approved after weeks of apparent hesitation. The letter doesn't mention vote buying. It speaks of securing support, facilitating timely progress, and discreetly rewarding services rendered in a spirit of mutual benefit. In other words, politics on the letterhead, money between the lines. Imagine the path these words took after leaving this desk. Not to a public office, but to private clubs where red velvet curtains muffled the sound, to private hotel rooms where cigars burned slowly while hands wiped ashes from vests. Campaign funds never appeared under the heading "payment for votes," but as consulting fees, legal fees, advisory services, subscription. A senator's campaign in need of new printers suddenly finds a patriotic benefactor. A state representative critical of railroad monopolies spends a quiet weekend on a rural property and returns with a more balanced view of the situation. None of this is explicitly written here, but the letter assumes the reader already knows how these collaborations usually work. On the table, the tip of a finger touches once on a specific phrase. Assurances have been received that opposition within the committee will be managed, provided our contributions remain credible and our expectations reasonable. There is no mention of debate, no indication that the measure might be rejected on its merits. The outcome is treated as a transaction, not a vote. Somewhere far from this library, factory whistles mark the start of yet another 12-hour shift. In cramped tenements, workers lace up their boots in the dim light, oblivious to the fact that their wages, their working hours, and the safety of the tracks they will help maintain have already been shaped by a paragraph in a letter hidden for over a century in a mansion on Fifth Avenue. It is here that the secrets of the Gilded Age take their most incisive form, not just in personal scandals, but in clauses that silently rewrite the rules for everyone else. The consequences of these agreements spread in ways that the letter never bothers to explain. Tariffs adjusted by a few percentage points make imported goods prohibitively expensive, keeping small merchants tied to distribution networks linked to these dynasties. Railway concessions granted on specific routes channel prosperity to some cities and away from others, transforming maps into instruments of reward and punishment. Approvals for consolidation allow a handful of companies, guided by offices like the one above this library, to swallow rivals until competition becomes a word for history books. Meanwhile, the official narrative celebrates the efficiency, progress, and wisdom of the legislature. There is a kind of guilt embedded in the careful euphemisms. The author never says bribery. Instead, he suggests honoring past commitments. He doesn't mention envelopes passed in coat pockets. He alludes to symbols of appreciation distributed through trusted channels. This is how a dark legacy remains respectable, through language that allows a man to sign his name under instructions that would sound criminal in common parlance, while still looking another man in the eye on the floor of the house. The letter becomes a mirror, not of what the laws say, but of how easily they bend when sufficient wealth leans in the right direction. Outside this room, the machinery of public records keeps turning. Bills are introduced and filed, debates are transcribed, votes are tallied and preserved in the archives. Anyone reading only these records would see a republic functioning as it should: motions, amendments, final counts. But here, on this single sheet of paper hidden behind a wooden panel, another file opens, one that never reached the state library. It reminds us that public archives can contain erased records as easily as ledgers and family trees. Not by removing pages, but by ensuring that some pages were never written. If you pay attention to the silence in the library, you'll notice a kind of echo between the present and those sessions of 1881. Gilded Age magnates occupied the gallery seats during important debates, their presence recorded in society columns, not political ones. Lobbyists crisscrossed the marble floors with briefcases under their arms, waving to the staff, exchanging brief polite greetings with men whose campaigns they had discreetly kept going. Some of these men would later become silent witnesses, their names appearing in correspondence like this, their public reputations forever tied to service and experience, while the private cost of their cooperation was measured in clauses like those that have now faded to brown on this page. The archivist's gaze wanders from the letter to the shelves surrounding the desk. Somewhere among these volumes, perhaps there once were scrapbooks, articles praising a new law, editorials extolling the courageous stance of a representative whose courage had been extensively funded. These scrapbooks have disappeared, replaced by curated volumes of art and literature, as if someone had quietly decided that certain stories no longer belonged in the house. Forbidden rooms aren't always locked behind doors. Sometimes they are entire rooms of memory that have been redecorated beyond recognition. Near the end of the page, a final political instruction appears, almost like a footnote. Should unforeseen resistance arise, a visible revision of our position may be considered, while preserving our substantive position through alternative instruments. It's a sentence that could be read aloud without embarrassment at almost any time, but it conceals an entire strategy of retreat and substitution. A law softened in public, while parallel agreements keep real power intact. It carries the weight of all the decisions made behind closed doors, where the price of protecting a legacy is paid by people whose names never appear in these lines. And this raises a question that lingers long after one's eyes turn away from the ink. If a dynasty could influence tariffs, railroads, mergers, and elections with nothing more than a series of necessary collaborations, what else within those walls could have been negotiable? As the archivist closes the folder, another document on the table shifts slightly, revealing a corner of an older, heavier ledger. On the exposed page, a column formerly titled Donations has been overwritten with a more neutral title, and below it, a name has been crossed out with such precision that only a ghost of the letters remains. A benefactor, or perhaps a beneficiary, erased with the same deliberate care that once drafted the clauses that now flicker under the library light. A little further down the page, after the careful choreography of markets and necessary collaborations, the letter turns inward. The handwriting tightens again, not from age, but from caution. A new paragraph begins without a title this time, merely a change of tone that anyone accustomed to reading secrets from the Golden Age would immediately recognize. It is no longer about stocks or tariffs. This is where the document delves into the family itself. The first sentence is almost bland. In order to avoid any future claims on the estate, it could be the opening sentence of any respectable will. But the words that follow do not belong to the public language of inheritance. They belong to the silent, private grammar of removal. The clause speaks of an individual connected to a collateral branch whose association, if proven, would be detrimental to the position of the main lineage. No name, no clearly defined kinship, just a shadow described in legal terms, someone close enough by blood ties to be dangerous, distant enough in status to be disposable. The instructions are precise. Steps must be taken to prevent any future claim of rights, to satisfy in advance any relevant expectations, and to ensure that the matter is not brought to any forum where examination of personal history is necessary. It is polished, controlled, and absolutely clear. The goal is not to resolve a dispute. It is to eliminate the possibility of it arising. The tools are familiar to anyone who studies the Gilded Age from the inside. There is mention of a modest but sufficient allowance, payable through intermediaries, the kind of discreet pension that doesn't appear on household accounts under its true purpose. The letter suggests that the lawyer prepare a binding instrument of discretion, a contract that will never be mentioned in family memoirs, but will be enforced with far more rigor than any sentimental promise. There is even a suggestion, expressed in the mildest possible language, that a change of residence may serve the mutual interest of all parties. The elegant way of saying, transfer this person to another city, another state, another coast, where the Fifth Avenue facade can no longer be associated with their face. Outside, the walls of this house, speeches about family values and moral leadership flowed easily from pulpits and platforms. The same surname that appears here, cautiously abbreviated, was once read aloud in churches as the benefactor of stained glass windows and orphanage wings. Scrapbooks from the time show wedding announcements written in enthusiastic prose, photos of brides entering carriages, the promise of alliances between two of our most respected families. However, in this clause, marriage is something completely different, a mechanism. The letter suggests a union to be encouraged with a person of suitable social standing, without connection to our interests, whose name will serve as an appropriate veil. Not a romance, a solution. If the inconvenient branch of the family tree can be discreetly grafted onto another lineage, the main trunk remains intact on paper. In public, these dynasties spoke of the sanctity of the home. In private, a panel in the library concealed a page authorizing the dismantling of one. One can almost imagine the scene that followed this clause, a meeting in a smaller living room, not the grand hall. Curtains half open in the afternoon, a decanter on a side table, 2 or 3 figures seated at a distance sufficient to avoid any suggestion of intimacy. No raised voices, only carefully chosen phrases about opportunity, a new beginning, a way to avoid unpleasant situations. On the mantelpiece, a photograph slightly turned away from the conversation, as if even the portrait had been excluded from what was being decided in its presence. The habits of elite American families of that time were not written only on invitations to balls and guest lists. They were written in these silent and irreversible decisions about who would be invited to remain part of history and who would be paid to live on the margins of it. Here, the idea of hidden heirs ceases to be a rumor whispered by distant cousins and becomes a line in formal correspondence. The clause makes a point of specifying that any descendants resulting from this connection will be considered as having been fully provided, a phrase that accomplishes much in few words. Descendants here are not a problem. It is a life, or more than one, reduced to a category that can be resolved by a regular monthly payment and a lawyer's signature. The person in question is never described in human terms. No age, no face, no mention of the frequency of their visits or what they were told about their origins. They exist in this letter only as a risk to be neutralized, a variable in a succession calculation. You can almost hear the silence surrounding that clause in the decades that followed. Domestic servants who preferred not to say, a housekeeper who left for family reasons, just as a certain child disappeared from the background of photographs. A room that had once been a nursery, its wallpaper faded beneath a later coat of paint, reclassified in the property. Inventories as storage. These are the silent witnesses of the Gilded Age homes. Not just people, but spaces that once meant one thing and were quietly reassigned to another as soon as decisions like this were made. The files are the same. A birth recorded in one place, crossed out in another. A baptismal record with a name blurred by a careless ink stain that doesn't appear anywhere else in the register. And then there is the weight of the question this letter leaves in your hands. Reading a sentence that so calmly negotiates the exchange of inheritance for silence, of blood for distance, how far do you take it? In the abstract, it's easy to condemn it. But in the soft light of the library, with family portraits framed in gold and names on book spines matching those carved in stone above museums and universities, something more complex hangs over the page. This clause not only exposes hypocrisy, it threatens to reopen wounds that were never publicly acknowledged and can no longer be treated personally. The people who signed it, the lawyers who drafted it, the inconvenient heir whose life depended on these sentences, they are all gone. The question remains for whoever turns the page now, faced with a truth that unites money, inheritance, and a name erased so intrinsically. Would you bring it to light or leave it buried to preserve everything that was built upon this absence? Beyond the moral calculation, the practical implications of a belated discovery are hard to ignore. Modern law has little patience for centuries-old secret agreements, but demonstrates great interest in estates, trusts, and charitable foundations. If this letter were presented in court today, it wouldn't resurrect the people involved, but it could shake the structures their descendants still occupy. Donations could be questioned. Foundations could be investigated regarding the origin of their initial capital. A museum wing bearing the family name could suddenly find itself at the center of a lawsuit alleging that part of its funding was based on a forced transfer of rights. The very institutions that have enhanced the dynasty's image for generations could become the stage where that image is shattered. That is the legal and financial shadow cast by this discreet clause. From a public standpoint, the story would be irresistible. A hidden heir, a forbidden agreement, the immaculate facade of a dynasty questioned by a single paragraph pulled from behind a panel in a Fifth Avenue library. The press, which had already helped shape the family's reputation, would now dissect it with forensic zeal. Old gossip would be rebranded as early news. Servant stories, almost forgotten, would be repurposed as new leads. A family that once carefully managed its appearances in the society pages would now find itself portrayed as the author of a dark legacy, a legacy in which its greatest crime was not only what they did, but the way they rewrote their own lineage so that the records matched the image they wanted to project. In this house, however, the noise of the outside world is still a distant concept. The only sound is the slight creaking of the chair as the reader leans back, letting the lines settle. Somewhere above, a floorboard responds with a soft lament, the ancient wood yielding under the weight of decades of footsteps, some remembered, others deliberately forgotten. The letter lies open to the clause that attempted to decide, once and for all, who was considered family and who was not. Around it, the room is filled with artifacts that reinforce the official version. A framed marriage certificate between two impeccable names, a silver-framed photograph of a christening, the baby's face clearly visible, the inscription on the back listing the godparents of appropriate social standing. Everything complete, everything correct. And yet, when a drawer in the same desk is carefully opened, just to store the letter, something small moves and rolls against the wood. It's a worn silver rattle, old enough that its design has gone out of fashion, still bearing faintly engraved initials that don't correspond to any child in the family Bible on the tea table. The metal is worn where a hand has frequently held it. The monogram has been gently erased, as if someone had tried over time to make the letters less sharp. In the register book, that name has been carefully erased. In official portraits, that child never appears. But here, in the dim light of the library, the object that contradicts the family's version of itself rests silently in the drawer, the only sound being the almost inaudible click when it stops, like a small, insistent echo of a life erased from the records, waiting, after all these years, to be noticed. Imagine, for a moment, that this letter hadn't slipped behind the back door. That in 1881 it had ended up where so many other stories from the Gilded Age ended up, on the desk of a reporter already suspicious of banks, railroads, and the new industrial royalty. All it would take is for an employee of that law firm, with conscience or resentment, to copy it by hand and pass it on wrapped in the pages of the previous day's newspaper. One envelope inside another, traveling from a quiet corridor in the upper part of town to a noisy newsroom downtown. The newspapers of the time adored scandals almost as much as they depended on publicity from the very men to whom this letter was addressed. One can imagine the editor weighing the pages in his hands, his eyes half closed as he examines the dates, the initials, the careful references to coordinated acquisition, necessary collaborations, preventing future claims. Outside in the street, boys shout headlines about a railway strike or a bank in trouble. Inside, the editor leans back in his chair, the wood creaking, his cigar with a crooked line of ashes as he calculates the risk. The circulation this story could bring versus the fury it would unleash in the living rooms and boardrooms that pay for his ink. If it had gone to print, the first articles wouldn't have mentioned the Dynasty directly. They would have started with an imposing house on Fifth Avenue or a certain railroad group, enough details for anyone important to recognize the targets. Financial reporters, who usually wrote in the dry language of headlines and freight, would suddenly have something more vivid to describe. Explicit instructions to manipulate markets, steer concessions, control elections from behind damask curtains. Investors, already nervous from previous panics, would have read these columns through clenched teeth, their fingers pressing harder on the newspaper paper as they realized that the game they trusted was, at least in part, rigged. In court, this letter would have been a gift to any lawyer bold enough to take on a giant. Fraud cases could have been built around its paragraphs. Contracts could have been challenged on the grounds that they were negotiated under conditions hidden from the other party. Minority shareholders, those with sufficient resources to fight at least, could have demanded investigations into mergers and fees awarded by supposedly independent committees. The letter would lie on the evidence table, its cream paper suddenly rough under the light of the gas lamps, while a clerk read, phrase by phrase, how a handful of men had joined together to shape markets, silence heirs, and distort laws in their favor. The damage would not have been limited to the ledger. Politicians whose initials appear in the necessary collaborations section would have faced uncomfortable questions. Why did they vote exactly as these men demanded and exactly when their campaigns were rescued from the financial crisis? Even in an era when the line between patron and politician was thin, there were limits to what the public would forgive when the evidence appeared in someone else's handwriting. An ambitious rival, sensing weakness, could have used the letter to open investigations, not out of pure virtue, but out of the same power calculation that created the scandal in the first place. And yet, despite all these possibilities, it is equally easy to imagine how quickly the story could have been suppressed. Editors were not independent in the modern sense of the term. A simple visit from a banker who controlled the newspaper's debts, or a railroad magnate who could redirect advertising, might have been enough to keep the most damaging phrases off the front page. A retraction could be printed in small print, clarifying that the document was misinterpreted or incomplete. Defamation lawsuits could be threatened if not filed, with the real purpose not of winning in court, but of draining the time and money of any potential accuser. Quietly, the original source of the leak might have more difficulty finding work, credit, and interview invitations. Within the family, the response would have been swift and almost clinical. Lawyers summoned to the mansion not through the main entrances, but through the servants' doors. Coats removed in the side corridors, meetings held late into the night, long after the lights in the formal rooms had been turned off. The patriarch's hand resting a moment longer on the back of his chair while the options were presented. Reach an agreement, fight, buy, bury. A matriarch adjusting her glove cuffs with a little more force than necessary as she was told what needed to. be done to protect her upstairs children from becoming caricatures in the newspapers. In public, the family would redouble its philanthropic efforts, new hospital wings, scholarships, benevolence set in stone. In private, they would begin the silent work of tracing every copy of the letter and anything that could shed light on its context. That's where the story returns to the library where the original now rests. If even the rumor of a revelation would have provoked such a reaction, then the absence of scandal tells its own story. No trials, no ruined campaigns, no dramatic editorials citing names. If the storm never broke, it's almost certain that someone, somewhere along the chain, chose a different solution. Law firm files accidentally reduced in a fire. Private files streamlined when firms merged or dissolved. Personal documents of key figures carefully selected before donation to universities, with certain boxes marked retained or destroyed after review. The pattern can be observed in the little that remains of other cases from that time. Sometimes a reference index lists a set of correspondences that are no longer in the box where they should be. Other times, a catalog entry notes, almost casually, that materials related to old corporate matters were removed before registration. No explanation, no signature, just an empty space where there should be context, and the feeling that someone once stood before a filing cabinet like this and made a decision about which stories deserve to reach the future. This is the true architecture of deleted records, not a single dramatic act, but a long series of small, deliberate omissions. Back at the mansion on Fifth Avenue, the letter in her hands becomes something stranger than evidence. It's a survivor of a purge that must have affected dozens, perhaps hundreds of pages. If this single piece ended up behind a panel in the library, what must have happened to the rest? Were they burned in the house's furnace? One winter night, the flames hidden beneath the familiar smell of coal. Were they boxed up and sent to a country estate for storage, never to be unpacked again? Or were they handled with even more care, led down a corridor no longer shown on the most recent blueprints, to a room never intended for guests or staff, a room belonging only to those who understood how dangerous paper can be? The archivist, his eyes now averted from the page, notices an old architectural drawing rolled up in a tube on a high shelf. When he carefully unfolds it on the same table, its edges crackle, the ink showing the mansion as it was shortly after its construction. Every corridor, every staircase, every service passage. The lines are precise, the rooms meticulously identified. But between the library and the rear wing, there is a small rectangular space marked with a single word, private, connected by a short corridor that doesn't exist in any of the modern framed plans downstairs. In the current map, this corridor has simply vanished, the walls drawn as if it had never existed. However, in the old sheet, the door is clear, a thin line of ink indicating an opening that is now covered by a continuous band of panels and shelves, as if the house itself, with all its carved wood and plaster, were trying to pretend that that room, and everything that was once kept in it, never needed to be remembered. On paper, a Fifth Avenue mansion is a simple diagram. A grand entrance hall, reception rooms, arranged along the street, an imposing staircase leading to the family bedrooms, and hidden behind all this symmetry, the discreet machinery that kept the house running. Service wings, narrow staircases in the back, private libraries, meeting rooms with wood paneling where the doors closed with a little more firmness than necessary. By the end of the Gilded Age, architects quickly learned that wealth demanded two types of space: the rooms where reputation was displayed and the rooms where that reputation was managed. Walking from the library towards the back of this house, it's still possible to perceive this logic in the floorboards. The hallway narrows almost imperceptibly. The plaster loses some of its ornamentation. The windows are higher on the wall. This was where private decisions were made under lower ceilings. In the old floor plan laid out on the table, there's a clear sequence: library, a small hallway, a small room marked private, and beyond it, a storage area. And then, the service staircase. In the real house, the library wall is continuous. at least at first glance. Only when you look closely do you realize that one section of shelving is slightly deeper than the others. The frame isn't perfectly aligned, as if a door had been swallowed by books. Behind this false uniformity, there once existed an inner layer of security. Mansions like this one often concealed small safes in their innermost rooms. Safes embedded in the masonry, disguised behind tapestries or paneled doors intended not for jewels, which could be worn in public, but for documents that could never leave the house. In the basement of this one, a disused wall safe still lies wide open, its door uselessly ajar, the paint slightly peeling where the heat once licked its surface. Inside, the shelves are empty except for a line of dust and the faint rectangular shadows where bundles of documents once rested. Someone, decades ago, cleaned it with a meticulousness that didn't quite reach the edges. Throughout the 20th century, families like this one learned a new word for destruction: rationalization. Archives were reduced, consolidated, simplified. A new generation of estate administrators arrived with metal cabinets and indexing systems, promising efficiency while quietly deciding which parts of the somber legacy needed to survive and which could disappear without a trace in the archives. Burning papers in a home furnace became less common, sending non-essential material to an off-site storage facility that no one ever visited again became far more acceptable. Silent witnesses were transformed into erased records, not with a single dramatic fire, but with a series of polite signatures at the bottom of disposal orders. And yet this letter did not follow the same path as the others. It was not stored in the official safe. It was not placed in a box with the rest of the mail destined for a law firm's vault or a university's collection. Someone made a different choice. Instead of placing it in a folder with a reference number, they hid it behind a panel in the library, the very room intended to showcase the family's intellect. Was it a younger heir, bothered by the apparent simplicity of the genealogies compared to what he had just read on the page? An employee who realized too late that the words he had typed would outlive him in ways he could not control? Or a more experienced employee, fully aware that when the order to destroy all confidential material arrived, the instruction would be followed to the letter, unless at least one letter slipped through the cracks? This single act of disobedience, doubt, or caution is the only reason we can read all of this. Everything else that should be around, the memos it refers to, the reactions it provoked, the copies filed in the company's general correspondence destroyed section, has been removed from our reach, scattered in ashes, landfills, or private collections where curators accept only what flatters the donor. In other scandals from the Gilded Age that have come to light, surviving documents often appear in clusters, a ledger here, a diary there, a pile of letters forgotten in a trunk. Here, there is only this page, this voice speaking from within the forbidden chambers of a Fifth Avenue dynasty. Back in the library, when the architectural drawing is rolled up again, the eye lingers on an almost insignificant detail. Along the baseboard, where the private corridor once ran, the wood's texture is interrupted for a moment, and a thin crack outlines the contour of a long plastered door frame. In the modern plan, this door no longer exists, but under the lamplight its ghost is still there, an entrance no longer recognized, leading to a space where the remaining documents were stored and where the silence behind the wall seems denser than any layer of paint. If you step back a little from the letter and analyze it in light of what we already know about the Gilded Age, it ceases to seem like an exception and begins to seem like a missing piece. The handwriting on this page could belong to any of the countless law firms that discreetly provided services to men like Gould, who once tried to monopolize the gold market with a series of moves so coordinated that the entire financial system trembled in what became known as Black Friday. In official accounts, these events are narrated as bold bets that went wrong, or as chapters in the history of American growth. But in private correspondence from that time, we see the same vocabulary you are observing now. Stabilization, protection of interests, timely intervention, different ink, same logic. Gould and his circle were not alone. The Vanderbilt clan, for example, left a trail of disputes over railroad lines, tariffs, and inheritances that still reverberate in biographies and court records. Coordinated speculation among friendly families, rumors deliberately spread to weaken a rival before an acquisition. The casual use of privileged information shared during dinners at private clubs. None of this was accidental. They were habits. The law was not a barrier, it was a tool, something to be distorted, interpreted, or postponed until it suited the decision already made behind the scenes. Read enough about these secrets of the Golden Age, and you'll begin to recognize the rhythm long before you finish the first sentence. This is what makes the Fifth Avenue letter so unsettling. Even. With the names blurred or reduced to initials, anyone familiar with this world can trace its outlines. The instructions on buying stock echo familiar panics. The language about necessary collaborations mirrors recorded patterns of campaign financing and legislative favors. The clause that neutralizes a potential heir belongs to the same family of tactics that has quietly shaped the family tree of more than one dynasty. It doesn't matter if this particular house has blood ties to a Gould, a Vanderbilt, or one of their rivals. The mentality is identical. This is the voice of an era that treated markets, laws, and people as pieces on the same chessboard. And this is where the document ceases to be merely a relic and becomes a question directed straight to whoever possesses it now. If you found something like this, buried in a mansion, hidden behind a panel, with the ink still sharp enough to redraw everything you thought you knew about a famous name, what would you do? Would you let time continue protecting the reputation etched on museum walls and university gates? Or would you bring the truth to light, even if it meant disturbing the history that comforted generations? It's easy to answer from a distance. It's harder when the portraits around you bear the same surname that funds scholarships, hospitals, and art collections today. Beyond the gilded halls of this house, historians have documented countless scandals of the era: monopolized markets, bribed officials, secret funds that defrauded younger children, depriving them of their share. These cases left behind a body of evidence, ledgers, diaries, testimonies, that survived long enough to be archived, cataloged, and cited. Here, in contrast, we have a stubborn page that somehow escaped the fire. It suggests the same pattern, but leaves the rest of the story in the shadows. Somewhere, in some archive or attic, there may have been more. A family register with an extra line, a baptismal record that didn't match the official genealogy, a lawsuit that never went to trial because someone accepted a settlement in a lawyer's quiet office. Back at her desk, the archivist picks up a thin, folded document kept under the family Bible. A family tree updated at the beginning of the 20th century. The branches spread neatly across the page, each marriage and birth noted in careful handwriting. Most of the lines are complete. Dates, middle names, organized notes in the margin about marriages into respectable families. But near the edge, between one generation and the next, there is a small horizontal line that leads nowhere. No name, no date, just a faint trace where the pen began and stopped. Someone drew a small crossbar across that unfinished line, turning it into a deliberate omission. It remains there, silent and unmistakable, like the outline of a life erased from the family history, awaiting the next pair of eyes brave enough to ask who should be written there and why they disappeared from the page. The more one reads the letter in conjunction with the surviving documents in the house, the more a pattern begins to emerge where the family insists there is only empty space. On the back of an old ledger, hidden among neatly arranged lines for coal, uniformed employees, and carriage repairs, there is a new entry from around the same year as the clause about preventing any future claim. Month after month, the same amount is recorded under a deliberately vague heading: external, stipend, educational, paid not to a cousin or known relative, but channeled through a small trust fund in another state. Cross-referencing this data with a crumbling receipt folder in a trunk in the basement, a pattern emerges. Tuition fees for a New England boarding school, paid on time, but always by a junior employee. A later note from a treasurer of a distant college thanking the family for continued support of a student who doesn't appear anywhere in the immaculate frame genealogy. upstairs. No one spells the surname the way this house bears it. Instead, the boy is registered with a simplified version of the name, the edges trimmed just enough to pass in a place where no one reads the New York Society pages. One can almost trace his path. Summers not on Fifth Avenue, but in rented rooms. Invitations not to dances, but to study groups, and eventually to a modest church wedding where the officiant pronounces his surname wrong, as recorded. His life unfolds like a private ledger carefully kept away from the main books. School fees, rent, a discreet dowry, the occasional inexplicable credit that appears just when a child is born, or an illness prolongs medical appointments. In all official family records, he doesn't exist. In the house's internal papers, he is everywhere and nowhere at the same time, a hidden heir managed like a legal exhibit, not welcomed as blood. This is the human cost compressed between these accounts of the Gilded Age, a dynasty that protected its surface by exporting its own reflection into the shadows, transforming a person into an item in the somber inheritance of its forbidden chambers. Decades later, when the 20th century begins to romanticize these families in art books and luxury magazines, marble staircases, glittering chandeliers, secrets of the Gilded Age, presented as charming anecdotes. The only clue that the official story is incomplete lies in a single group photograph propped up on a side table. The family posed on the entrance steps, all faces sharp under the flash of morning light, except for a blurred oval near the edge, where the emulsion has been carefully rubbed away, as if someone, long ago, had decided that any name that was there no longer had the right to be seen. As the 20th century settled in, the same surnames that once whispered in railroad negotiations and forbidden rooms began appearing on the facades of museums, libraries, and concert halls. Wings were inaugurated, galleries received. Donations, scholarships were created for promising young people of modest means. The marble staircases of the Gilded Age were repurposed as settings for charity galas, and the language surrounding these families softened. No longer railroad magnates and market manipulators, but patrons, benefactors, guardians of culture. As Hollywood's golden age consolidated, the world learned to consume a polished version of the American elite. Ballrooms bathed in soft light, romances framed as destiny, secrets of the Gilded Age reduced to charming anecdotes about lost tiaras and misinterpreted engagements. Royal scandals were discreetly replaced by stories that looked good in black and white. Universities and large institutions readily accepted donations, naming halls in honor of men whose lawyers once drafted clauses like the one hidden in this library. In return, they received carefully curated collections, letters that spoke of good taste and duty, diaries that focused on travel and art, scrapbooks where newspapers praised generosity and never mentioned deleted entries or hidden heirs. The most delicate material followed a different path. Some were stored in law office vaults, removed from public research guides. Others went through discreet auctions, sold in lots described only as private correspondence. And some never left the houses, reduced to ashes in basement ovens, or locked in safes whose keys were silently lost. This is what makes the surviving letter such a big problem. It doesn't fit into the later narrative. It doesn't sound like the polished speeches quoted in commemorative books or the lines attributed to elegant patriarchs in Hollywood dramas. It's proof of a dark legacy, written by the same hand that signed museum checks, a fragment that refuses to be incorporated into the family's official history. When researchers of our century return to these archives with different questions, questioning not only who donated what, but how these fortunes were initially obtained, this single page becomes a point of friction, a splinter that lodges under the fingernail of the accepted myth. In the library, beneath the restored plaster and carefully lit portraits, the tension is almost palpable. Exhibition catalogs on the shelves describe the dynasty in bright, neutral prose. A brochure from a university foundation lists the family as visionary partners, and on the table the letter lies open, its clauses silently contradicting every polished line. As the archivist looks up, drawn to a large oil painting on the opposite wall, one detail refuses to blend in, A family group arranged on a terrace, all faces depicted in minute detail, except for a single figure near the edge, whose features have been excessively erased, the paint diluted to a vague oval where a face should be, as if the canvas itself had long ago been persuaded to forget exactly who had been there. More than a century after the ink dried, the people around the letter look very different, but the room is strangely familiar. The chandelier has been reconfigured with LEDs, the curtains replaced with museum-quality fabric, but there is still a desk under the same stretch of wall, and now a fine pair of archival gloves rests beside the page. The person who saw it could be many things: a university research fellow, an archivist hired to catalog the contents before the sale of the house, a buyer of historic properties whose curiosity led him beyond the real estate brochure. His chair makes the same small creaking sound as the patriarch's did, the wood creaking softly as he leans closer to the words that have survived all attempts to bury them. Outside this room, a web of contemporary interests closes as soon as news of the discovery begins to circulate. There are heirs, scattered across cities and countries, whose names still guarantee them seats on boards and positions in foundations. Their lawyers read scanned copies of the letter on high-resolution screens, slowly scanning them, observing the implications. The admission of coordinated operations with shares, the references to necessary collaborations with legislators, the clause about the hidden heir managed as a liability. A representative of a major museum, already envisioning an exhibition on the Gilded Age, cautiously inquires about provenance and sensitivity. A university archive expresses interest in acquiring the document as part of its collection on American capitalism, on the condition that it can be made available to researchers. Each of them sees the same page and a different line of risk. On the table, options begin to pile up like folders. One possible path would bring the letter directly to light, digitized, cited in an academic article, displayed under glass in an exhibition about the secrets of the Gilded Age and the price of power. Context would be added, chronologies, photographs, other cases demonstrating the frequency of this type of maneuver. Visitors would line up, reading the impeccable handwriting that transformed people into problems and scandal into pressure. For historians of the Gilded Age, it would be a rare and perfect piece of evidence, anchoring what has so often been inferred from rumors and incomplete records. The name of the dynasty, carefully restored throughout the 20th century, would be dragged into new debates about the dark legacy and the true cost of philanthropy. Another path is more tranquil, more familiar to the family. The letter could be transferred to an institution under restricted conditions, sealed in a box, cataloged, but with the indication "closed until," followed by a date that would far exceed the lives of everyone present in the room. Researchers would see a note in the research guide: confidential correspondence, restricted access, and make a note to return it someday. The gift could continue more or less undisturbed. Scholarships granted, invitations to gala events printed, the house itself possibly opened as a museum of architecture and heritage, with guided tours that would omit the uncomfortable history hidden in the library. The letter would still exist, but as a silent witness, its voice postponed in favor of preserving the image that the dynasty has built in the popular imagination. There is also the oldest option of all, cloaked in modern language: negotiation. A family representative might offer to buy the document in its entirety, to reintegrate it into the family archive. The expression sounds respectable, but everyone at the table understands what it might mean. The letter disappearing into a private safe, its future governed by confidentiality agreements and tacit guarantees that responsible management sometimes requires limits. Perhaps a carefully crafted statement would follow, acknowledging that, like many families of the Gilded Age, our ancestors were products of their time, without ever addressing the specific clauses of the page. The market for the family name as a brand associated with museums, foundations, and luxury ventures would remain virtually intact. The price of this stability would be yet another layer of erased records, another forbidden room closed just when someone finally found the key. Amidst all these possibilities, the letter remains unmoved. Its existence reveals how the decisions made in 1881 still reverberate to this day. In the concentration of wealth, in the stories textbooks tell about visionary founders, in the way we imagine the facades of Fifth Avenue whenever we think of success. Whether revealed or concealed, it raises a question that concerns less a specific dynasty and more how we choose to remember an entire era. Are we satisfied with the softened portraits painted by Hollywood and art books, or do we allow documents like this to redraw the contours of the Gilded Age with all its hidden heirs and silent witnesses? While the conversation oscillates between legal responsibility and historical duty, the researcher's gaze drifts to the bookshelves. Among the gleaming volumes about the house and its secrets of the Golden Age, all marble, silk, and candlelight, lies a thin, old booklet from a small local historical society, its spine crooked and its cover slightly faded. Someone pulls it out, and as it unfolds on the table, a black and white photograph stands out. The family posing on the same library threshold, with the same wooden panel behind them. Each figure is identified in ink beneath the image, except one, near the edge, its outline sharp, its features subtly blurred by retouching, and a single line where a name should be, scratched so heavily that the paper is almost worn away, guarding a silence as dense as any vault. The letter, spread out on the table, is small enough to disappear under a single open book. And yet, everything you've just traversed in this house, its gilded halls, its forbidden rooms, its meticulously retouched portraits, fits into the few paragraphs written on that cream-colored page. In one passage, the handwriting transforms market theory into choreography, directing stock purchases and price stabilization, like a conductor leading an orchestra. In another, it lowers its tone to outline necessary collaborations with legislators whose public speeches never mention the conversations held in private clubs. Further on, the ink hardens around a clause that treats one's own blood as a negotiable risk, outlining how to transform a potential heir into a silent witness paid to live elsewhere under a softened name. All signed and dated 1881, the height of the Gilded Age, and all pushed at some point behind a wooden panel, as if the distance from the light could undo what the pen had already done. The distance between public discourse and private practice has rarely been as great as here. Superficially, this dynasty championed sound markets, moral values, and the American home. Their names adorned churches and libraries. Their wives presided over charity galas. Their children served on university boards. Newspapers published profiles that resembled old press releases, praising their forward-thinking vision and moderation. But in the letter, the same surnames, reduced to initials, yet unmistakable in context, use the law not as a limit, but as a tool. Regulations become obstacles to be mapped and circumvented. Corporate structures become facades behind which capital can move unnoticed. Family becomes a category that can be reduced on paper to fit the exact image the patriarch wishes to etch in stone. The distance between these two narratives is not measured in kilometers, it is measured in clauses. This is why a single surviving document can reveal so much about a century. This page contains, in miniature, the entire architecture of the secrets of the Golden Age, the financial scandal that never exploded because the market was manipulated beforehand, the political manipulation that never made headlines because votes were guaranteed even before the election. The hidden heirs relocated to other states, their stipends recorded in internal ledgers while their names were erased from the genealogy. The forbidden rooms and sealed vaults where compromising documents were gathered for one last review before being burned. Most of the evidence of this system has long been destroyed or dispersed, but what remains here is enough to show the pattern, the dark legacy that runs like a structural beam beneath the marble and silk. Observe carefully, and you will see how this worked in practice. A railway panic that appeared accidental to the public coincides perfectly with the timeline described in the letter. A fare change that benefited the productive company takes on a different meaning when one knows which donors were discreetly funding important campaigns. A scholarship created decades later and still praised in glossy brochures, had its origins in profits protected by the same operations described in this text. The letter does not describe just one moment. It describes a method that allowed wealth and influence to travel together through generations, while the costs of this arrangement fell on people whose names never appeared in any of the framed documents in the house. This is where the moral weight lies, not in the existence of wealth itself, but in how it was defended. Within this story, a person becomes a variable. An entire life is managed as a matter to be fully supplied, as if affection and recognition were optional extras that could be omitted once legal exposure was neutralized. Somewhere far from Fifth Avenue, a child grew up with a surname that almost coincided with that of a dynasty, but never quite did, with tuition paid on time and their presence politely omitted from any narrative that might one day be published. The official memory of the family remains clean, symmetrical, marketable. The human life altered by a signature remains. In the shadows, glimpsed only in supplementary books and a blurred face on the edge of a photograph. This is the clearest measure of how far this house was willing to go to protect its own reflection. And yet, the letter exists. Someone chose not to keep it in the safe downstairs. Someone decided it shouldn't travel with the rest of the sensitive material sent to law offices when the 20th century demanded streamlined filing and tax deductions. Instead, it was hidden behind a panel in the very room meant to showcase the family's cultured mind, a library brimming with carefully selected volumes and meticulously crafted stories. Whether out of rebellion, caution, or a silent appeal to some future reader, this act broke the hitherto perfect chain of erased records. It ensured that at least a fragment of the truth survived to oppose the polished myth. Now the dilemma has simply shifted course over time. The people who once signed, ordered, or obeyed those instructions are long gone. In their place are heirs, institutions, brands, and stories. Museums depend on donations bearing that surname. Universities hold professorships funded by that fortune. Films and novels, built upon a softened image of the Gilded Age, continue to sell the idea of sumptuous mansions and noble responsibilities instead of forbidden rooms and negotiated silences. Bringing this letter to light raises uncomfortable questions, not only about a family, but about how we allow an entire era to be remembered, and who benefits when certain truths remain politely out of the picture. Thus, the page remains on the table for another moment, the ink catching the light from the lamp that once shone on property registry books, and later on art books about the grandest houses in America. The house is silent. In the hallway, footsteps fade. A door closes softly, ending another part of the visit. Here, only the rustle of gloves and the whisper of turning paper disturb the air. The archivist's gaze returns to the small family tree found earlier, now open beside the letter. In the margin, between two solid branches of the family tree, the same interrupted line awaits, a line that begins to extend, then stops, scratched until the paper thins. A letter on the hidden page and a line on the public family tree, mirroring each other across a century. The record that spoke so clearly and the name that was never written in full, keeping between them a silence that has lasted much longer than anyone who agreed it should exist. The chart remains open on the table, the broken line between two branches catching the light each time the lamp's flame flickers. Beside it, the letter rests perfectly flat, its edges no longer hidden by the wood or wallpaper, but still carrying the same deliberate silence that once kept it behind the panel. Around these two objects, the library regains its quietude, shelves rising in the shadows, particles of dust floating in the narrow beam of light escaping through. A gap in the curtains, the muffled echo of a door closing somewhere deeper in the house. Nothing moves, and yet the room seems reoccupied by all the decisions, calculations, and omissions compressed onto a single sheet of paper and a line that never became a name. Stepping back a bit, the scene could belong to any of the grand houses that lined Fifth Avenue at the height of the Gilded Age. Each possessed its own archives, its own obscure legacy carefully organized behind polished facades. Letters folded in secret compartments, ledgers kept in forbidden rooms, portraits retouched until an inconvenient face blended into the background. What we witness in this mansion is not an isolated scandal, but a pattern that reveals a rare, almost disturbing clarity. Financial orchestration disguised as prudence, political influence shrouded in the language of service, hidden heirs managed from afar, and stories rewritten until only the most flattering angles remained. All this contained here in the steady hand of a lawyer who presumed his words would only be read by the right eyes. Tonight, they were read by someone else. Not a patriarch or a politician, but a figure sitting alone at a desk, listening to the faint ticking of an invisible clock and the soft rustling of the ancient beams above. The library holds its breath as if it knows it has just betrayed itself. The panels, once meant to conceal, now frame the very document they should swallow. The family tree, which should display an unbroken lineage of respectability, silently reveals its own gap. Even the air seems thinner, as if the house has been forced to inhale the words it has tried for so long to exhale into oblivion. If you choose to follow stories like this, it won't be out of morbid curiosity, but a different kind of loyalty to the historical record, to the lives lost within its lines, and to the understanding that wealth and shadow have always walked hand in hand through these corridors. There will always be more doors that have been plastered over, more safes broken into only to be emptied, more maps where a single erased mark indicates that something once existed there. If you wish to continue traversing these corridors with us, stay close to this investigation so that you are here when the next sealed door finally opens. Deep down, in the foundations of history, there are still voices that never made it into the official records. Clerks who copied letters, laborers who carried boxes to the furnace, hidden heirs whose lives were relegated to footnotes and then to oblivion. Their testimonies rarely survive as complete accounts. Instead, they emerge as fragments, receipts, marginal notes, a blurred face in a family photograph. Leave your comments below. Every perspective helps illuminate what history has tried to bury, and sometimes the smallest observation is enough to bring a silent witness back to the surface. In our time, even ruins are read by machines. Algorithms decide which corridors are worth revisiting, which archives remain in darkness. If this story sounds familiar, tell us. It indicates to the algorithm that these forgotten halls deserve to be explored again, that there is value in returning to places where the official narrative falters and the unauthorized document begins to manifest itself. The more frequently these rooms are accessed, the harder it becomes to silently reorganize their contents when the light goes out. Beyond this house, other mansions still stand with their shutters drawn, protecting them from the passing decades. Their panels have not yet moved. Their maps have not yet been questioned under the modern light. Their inscriptions may still be asleep behind the plaster and paint. And if you are willing to venture even further into the shadows, the next room awaits you, not as a spectacle, but as yet another attempt to decipher what the Golden Age wrote in a calligraphy that never expected strangers to decipher. For now, the letter is returned to the folder. The chart is folded following the old folds. The lamp's light is dimmed. The library door closes with a rhythmic click, leaving the shelves in their long vigil. Somewhere inside, a single line on a family tree and a single page of instructions remain face to face in the darkness, guarding between them a century of questions that survive only because those who feared the answers left enough for someone else to find them.